One of the questions that many preachers wrestle with is the whole question of preaching on controversial issues, the hot button issues. They wonder, should I preach on them? Should I preach on them at all? And if I do preach on them, how do I do that? Well, different preachers have taken different approaches to this. There are some preachers who simply avoid the hot button controversial issues altogether, and they have different reasons for it. Some will say that they want their parish, their church, to be a welcoming church. They want to be inclusive. They don't want to create waves that divide people. Other preachers will say hot button issues, the controversial issues, yes, they are important, but they can't be fully or adequately dealt with in a typical North American 10-minute homily, and that it wouldn't do it justice. And in fact, if you have some subjects like, for example, same-sex attraction, and you realize the complexities of the congregation, that there may be some in the congregation who have same-sex attraction, there may be parents whose children have same-sex attraction, that there are all kinds of different issues and different ways of hearing that just could not be done in a homily, and it'd be overcomplicated. So they choose to do it perhaps in a different forum, in a longer evening talk or something like that. There are others who simply do not do controversial preaching on hot button issues out of fear, because they don't want the backlash, because they don't want the letters to the bishop or the calls to the bishop or turning up on the front page of the newspaper. There have been many cases recently where preachers who are preaching at funeral homilies of with various situations in the funeral homily, and it ends up into a big media case, which goes on the internet and goes on newspapers, and becomes an issue for the bishop to manage, and so on. And many preachers simply just want to avoid that. Then there are other preachers who say we cannot avoid that. Right from the very beginning, preaching has been contentious. After all, after Jesus's first homily, if you want to call that a homily in Nazareth, after he unrolled the scroll, and he's declaring that he himself is the fulfillment, and after he preaches and talks about how God's grace has come to people outside of the Jewish people, they want to throw him off a cliff. Jesus keeps preaching and he's crucified. You have the preaching of St. Stephen, and he becomes a martyr for us. All the apostles, when they preach the word, end up as martyrs, or in St. John's case, an exile. And throughout our Catholic history, we have preachers who have made the decision to preach in strong ways about controversial issues and paid a price. St. John Chrysostom preached to the people after the riots on the statues. There was a riot about taxes, and they were tearing down statues, very much like we hear happening in the world today. And he spoke directly to them and critiqued them for that. And at the same time, he also spoke directly to the Empress Eudoxia, criticizing her for the way that she lived. But he paid a price. He was exiled twice. Savonarola in Florence spoke directly and clearly about the way he saw people living. He organized and encouraged the bonfire of the vanities, where they were burning frivolous things from their lives. And he spoke and critiqued Rome and critiqued the Pope. He spoke very forcefully and was martyred, was burned at the stake. When I was in Florence last, I stood right at the spot. Well, it's marked there in the piazza. This is the spot that Savonarola was burned at the stake. Other preachers, the Cure de Ars, were famous for preaching very strongly, almost ascetically, against vices and evils of the age. So what do we do in our age when there are certainly issues, as particularly as our civilization has entered into a post-Christian civilization, and where the values of the world are radically different from Christian values, where at one time there was a more or less an aligning of values as to the value of life, what marriage means, and a certain respect for the Bible and the Christian faith, and so on. But now the values of the world and Scripture are quite far apart, almost as they were at the beginning of the whole Christian story. So that now we have abortion unregulated, we have calls for assisted suicide and redefinitions of marriage and so on. So what does a preacher do? Well, there are a number of things that a preacher should do and a few things that a preacher may want to avoid. The first thing that a preacher should do is to really be aware of what he's doing if he's decided that he is going to preach on the controversial issues. In other words, that he's made a clear decision to do that, and therefore not to expect or not to be surprised when he gets some kind of pushback or he gets some kind of criticism. But if you make that decision, to be prepared for that. The second thing is the preacher always is best when one's preaching on controversial issues to not do it unless one has got established, or wait until one has established a relationship, a connection with the congregation. So if you're a new priest in a parish, rather than starting off on a clear attack on something which is you see is clearly wrong, the important thing is to first establish a relationship. Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium speaks about preaching as the image of a preacher as a mother speaking to a child, and the child is on the mother's knee, and it builds that relationship so first that the child knows that it is loved, and then when the child knows it is loved, it is possible to say even difficult, hard disciplinary words, and that will be more accepted, that can be taken in because the child knows the child is loved first. If one is an associate pastor, if one is a deacon, it's a very good idea if one is going to talk about one of the controversial or hot button issues to, out of courtesy, to let the pastor know first, because it is the pastor's parish and the pastor will be in the front lines of any kind of feedback from that. And if the preacher has decided to do this, it is very important to have a copy of the homily. Other videos have spoken in my series have spoken about or advocated preaching without a text, which is a marvelous way to preach in a dynamic conversational way. And I'll give you several methods to do it. But homiletic writers who advocate preaching without a text still strongly advise that the whole text be written out first. It's just that it's not brought up. It's not memorized, but but the preacher has gone through it to make sure he can find all of the words and that he's organized a structure for him that works. In the case of controversial preaching, it's very important to have some kind of text so that the exact words of what the preacher said are preserved somewhere. And if the preacher thinks it's going to be particularly controversial, let's say within the congregation there's a division, one faction against another, might be a good idea to have someone actually record with their cell phone maybe the homily as it goes, so that if there's some charge that is made later on, the truth of the matter, what was actually said and how it was actually said, can be demonstrated. Another very important principle for all of this is that the preacher always needs to keep in mind what the church has asked from its preachers for preaching, and that is that the scriptures of that Mass are the central part, the meat of the preaching, that the preaching begins, continues, is surrounded by through the scriptures of that particular Mass, not scriptures that you pick out of the air from somewhere else. So that means that the preacher is when a preacher wants to bring in controversial issues, they should emerge out of the readings and the liturgical prayers that the church has given us for that weekend. So if the priest wants to, or the deacon, the preacher wants to, has particular things to say about marriage, for example, then rather than just parachuting it in whenever he feels like it, he waits till the readings come that address that raise the issue. Maybe it's the wedding of Cana or something else, and out of that then brings the issue. If the issue is something that needs to be addressed right away, but the readings don't connect with it, then it may be that that particular issue needs to be addressed separately, perhaps after communion in a separate address to the congregation. But the homily should always preserve itself, that liturgical context, that scriptural context. And there are ample opportunities for preachers to speak on any issue, life issues, marriage issues, and so on, from the text as they arrived at the right time. So it doesn't seem that the preacher is imposing a personal agenda of what is really important to him, as rather what is important to the readings of the church. Sometimes these issues can be raised in just through side references. So, for example, when if one has a reading and it says, "Do not be conformed to the world, but conform our minds, our wills to the will of God." So, when the preacher deals with the expression "do not conform our ways to the ways of the world," then a series of examples could be used. A series of examples of assisted suicide or whatever issue, that divorce and remarriage, whatever issue issues that come to mind, which are examples of the ways of the world, which are not inconsistent with the ways or the teachings of the church. Another very important principle in all of this is for the preacher to keep focused on the issue and to do it with all charity, so that he doesn't come across as angry or mean-spirited, but rather that when you hear the preacher speaking the mind of the church on this particular hot topic, this particular issue, one is hearing the preacher give a human face to the church, an understanding face to the church, a reasonable face to the church. One way that a preacher can do that is by not isolating the worst motives that people have for the different opinions or different practices which are out of teaching, out of sync with the church, but to ascribe the best motives to them. So, for example, when speaking about state-sponsored assisted suicide, which is abhorrent to the church, which is against our position on the preservation and the dignity of life. Yet at the same time, the preacher can recognize that there are people who hold that position who are not doing it because they're mean people, because they want to kill old people. They are people who they look at suffering, and they cannot validate suffering. They cannot accept that suffering for someone who is incurable and it's just going to go on and on. They have, from their point of view, they are being merciful. They are wanting to help. And the same for a case of somebody who is maybe pro-choice, who believes that abortion is a decision. We don't have to ascribe the motive that they hate babies and they want to kill babies. It can be that we ascribe, yes, there are people who see that there are some women who feel trapped, who are in panic, who feel that there's no way out, who feel their lives are over, who feel that their families are abandoning them, or perhaps if it's a woman, the father has abandoned the woman, and so she feels trapped. And so they are seeing this as concern for that person. It's misguided, but one can start with, there are people who hold positions which are not in keeping with the church, who are doing so with good motives, but they've come out wrong-headed. And so what we do by putting a human face on the church and speaking reasonably, we try to open up the understanding of why the church holds that position and why it's holding that position out of love. Another way to proceed with that, with this human face of the church, is to, as Pope Francis would say, that we are not imposing but proposing, so that we aren't using the moral laws of the church as some sort of heavy set of rules which we are imposing on people and creating almost a Pelagian outlook that people need to save themselves by following all the rules, but rather that we are proposing the church's way of a fully integrated and healthy life in the Lord, a way of holding up positive values of marriage, positive values of life, and so on. This is a way that then brings the controversial issue into a conversation that helps people who may be on the other side, who are listening, because there are people in the congregation who are not fully on side with the church, or people who are not clear, who are confused. It lets them first hear that the preacher understands how people may have come to the other position, and then helps them understand why the church is saying that position is really not the position that we can hold as a Christian Catholic people, and that the position that the Catholic Church has is a position of love, it's a position of dignity, it's a position that is meant for our best. And in any of these issues, whatever one may be speaking about, a fundamental characteristic of the homily, which Pope St. Paul VI said very early on in Evangelii Nuntiandi, that the homily is to be an act of hope, an act of love. So no matter how dark one can describe the things that are going on, and no matter how many demons that we can name in the world, the homily should not leave the people in the darkness and not leave them with the demons, but show them a way, show them a light, show them alternatives, show them how to live up to the Christian view, a way out. There are some things that the preacher needs to avoid. One thing that the preacher needs to avoid is imposing his own particular view of things. So because he has been commissioned to speak in the name of the church, not in his own name. So there are some preachers, when we speak about hot button issues, they may be hot button moral issues for them, but they could be other issues for them which has to do with church governance, or some have very liberal or very traditional views on regulations for the Mass and so on, and those become hot button issues for them. But for the preacher, the personal agenda needs to be removed from the picture, so that when the congregation looks at the preacher is seeing a finger that is pointing to that crucifix. And the church certainly calls us to examine our contemporary life with the lens of Scripture. And we first look through the lens of the church at Scripture. So we now have sort of two lenses, so that now we can interpret the world. But it always is done in the name of the church. The preacher needs to avoid any kind of moralism, and the preacher needs to avoid any kind of mean-spirited quality, any quality to the homily that makes it seem unreasonable and uncharitable. When the preacher does all of that, the preacher then is able to contact and connect with the audience on many difficult issues with hope that is based on the text. And he's able to do it fully in the name of the church. I started earlier speaking about St. John Chrysostom. And St. John Chrysostom, in his very famous Easter homily, shows this embrace of quality, where he addresses those people who maybe are not living up fully to the church. And yet, at this Easter homily, he shows a hope that we can all participate. He proposes an ideal vision. So he says, let those who have borne the burden of Lent now receive their pay. And those who have toiled since the first hour, let them receive their reward. And those who may have come at the 6th, and even those he receives at the end, he gives rest to him who comes. Come, all of you, he says, enter into the joy of the Lord. You the first and you the last, you rich and you poor, dance together. You sober and you weaklings, celebrate the day. You have kept the fast, and you who haven't, rejoice today. And in that spirit, he holds out, here is the ideal. We know there are some people who do not live up the ideal, but he proposes to them a hope and a unity that can bring everyone together in the arms of a loving church with a human face.